Today we will talk about fats, and the reading for today was chapter 4 of the book Brain Food. So, in large part, we are misinformed about fats. We were told for a long time that all fat was bad, and the ideal diet had almost zero fat. This has been controversial um, for decades, really, just decades and decades. I'm sure in the 1800s people didn't think much about it, but ever since this sort of premier study was put together by Ansel Keys that showed that fat was related to heart disease, people said, get rid of fat. Well, there are lots more reasons, a lot more reasons to explain that relationship or to criticize the findings of Ansel Keys. A little bit beyond what we'll talk about today. However, what we do know is that those findings that fat equals bad is not accurate. In fact, not accurate at all, except for trans fats. And so we are misinformed. Fats are not bad for us. They're not at all bad. In fact, they're critical for our health. And that includes cholesterol, that includes saturated fat, that includes triglycerides. These things all have a very important role to play in the way the body functions. And so thinking that your best options are to have zero fat or as close to zero fat as you could, to lower your fat intake, to have your cholesterol be as low as possible, this is not necessarily the best thing for your health. There are many other reasons why your body might make more fat than you need, and a lot of that is sugar. And there are lots of reasons to not have any intake of trans fats at all. However, saturated fat, cholesterol, those are needed by your body. So not all fats are equally great, including facts. Not all facts are also equally great, but not all fats are equally great. What we need is a balance in the kinds of fats that we eat. And generally what we need, and this is sort of, you'll see this theme again, what we need is more plants in our diet, more plants. So in terms of what fats are, there are basically four kinds of fats. There are the fatty acids, and you get most of these from plants, from plankton, which are the ones, so the algae, and then the fish that eat those, all the way up to the fish that eat those, etc. So you can get fatty acids both from plants and fish. So if you think about fish oil, they're really talking about fatty acids, or generally the way we think of it as mostly is omega-3 fatty acids, although there are more kinds than just omega-3s. There's triglycerides. You get those from animals, and we make triglycerides. There's phospholipids. You get those both from plants and animals, number of sources, organ meats and eggs, all the way to nuts, seed oil seed kind of things like chia seed or flaxseed, etc. And cholesterol you get from animals, and we make cholesterol in our body. We make more cholesterol than we eat, for sure. So dietary cholesterol and the cholesterol that our liver makes are two different sources of cholesterol. So let's talk first about fatty acids. Now, nearly all kinds of fatty acids are the kinds that our bodies will make themselves, except for two kinds, omega-6 fatty acids, which are linoleic, and omega-3 fatty acids, which are alpha linolenic acids. So those two kinds we call essential fatty acids, or EFAs. So you might see EFA here or there in readings. That means essential fatty acids. When we don't have enough of these essential fatty acids, our deficiency creates anemia, which may be surprising. You may think that anemia is only a thing that has to do with iron or sickle cells. But anemia, and this is not the pernicious anemia either, which is really more about B12 and gut production of B12. But this is created by a deficiency in fatty acids. And you'll see why this is in a minute, because, I'll tell you, it has to do with oxygen transport, really. So you have a deficiency, you may have also chronic eczema, you may have hair loss. There are other things that also create those three issues. So it's not just a deficiency in fatty acids, but certainly a deficiency in fatty acids can cause those things. And other things in children, infants. So fatty acids are really critical during pregnancy and for newborn babies. Breast milk, of course, is a good source of a lot of things for the baby, and feeding them plenty of that to help them with their fatty acid intake is useful. But in order to do that, of course, the mother has to also be taking in plenty of these essential fatty acids. Okay, so EFAs, the omega-6 and the omega-3 fatty acids in particular, make up cell membranes. In large part, the whole cell membrane is made up of fats. And fats are, if you don't have them, you won't really have cell membranes, which means you won't really have a self at all. And so you want great functioning cell membranes. You want them to be fluid and flexible enough that they can do a good job of one of their purposes, which is, of course, to hold the cell together, keep the things in the cell, but also to regulate the entry of what comes in and what goes out of the cell. You want nutrients to come in, you want toxins, viruses, etc., to stay out. And so if your cell membranes are healthy, that means they have enough fatty acids making them up, then that's useful. If the cell membrane has more omega-3 fatty acids than omega-6, that is also more helpful for that cell in terms of generally anti-inflammatory actions, but it's helpful for that cell's health. Okay, you need fatty acids, both of these, omega-6s and 3s. They're required so that you can absorb the oxygen in your lungs. And so inside the lungs, also transferring oxygen to red blood cells, fatty acids are important for that. And then transporting, again, the red blood cell oxygen into the tissues also depends on fatty acids. So fatty acids are important for oxygen transport. They're also converted into other forms. So there are a number of enzymes and other such things that create, I can't think of the word, that convert, that's it, that convert these essential fatty acids into other forms that kind of down the road lead to lots and lots of other biochemical processes in the body. They will affect a large number of things. One of those things is inflammatory processes. But as you are going to see, it's a little more complicated than all inflammatory, all anti-inflammatory. It's not quite that simple. The body is quite complex, and we try to make it easy to understand by just saying things like all saturated fat, bad, all olive oil, good. It's not that simple. And so some of the other forms that fatty acids will take after conversion with, interacting with other biochemicals are the EPA and DHA that we love to see from omega-3 fatty acids. We've done a lot of research on EPA and DHA, and they're wonderful for all of the things, including brain health, including attention, and including mood. Arachidonic acid, prostaglandins. So the prostaglandins are very complicated. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of prostaglandins. They do all kinds of things in the body. And you think about prostaglandins, I kind of think about, they're involved in contracting smooth muscles. And so when you're on your period and you're cramping, if you're a woman, then you can think of prostaglandins as being part of the cause of that, because prostaglandins will help contract smooth muscle. So a lot of times you'll take a medication that is an anti-prostaglandin. So great. Except prostaglandins do way, way, way more than just contract smooth muscles. And super interesting, the reason they're named prostaglandins is simply because the first one was discovered in the prostate. And so now they were called prostaglandins. They're really not just about prostate at all. There's all kinds of things they do. But I just think it's interesting that sometimes we get stuck naming things and then the name ends up not being very helpful. Leukotrienes are really needed by your immune system, and they are a result of conversion of fatty acids. Okay, you need a balance of omega-6s and omega-3s. This is the biggest part of it. It's not about, I just need these essential fatty acids. What you need is a balance between the two. We get plenty of omega-6 in our diets. You never, ever, ever have to worry about that, ever. You don't have to do anything special to get plenty of omega-6. What happens is you do have to do something special to make sure you get enough omega-3 in your diet. It didn't used to be that way because we didn't used to eat the way we do now. But if you eat kind of the standard Western diet, also called the SAD, the SAD diet, right? Then you have to work all the time to make sure that you have enough omega-3 in your diet, because the balance is important. So here's why balance is important. Suggested ratio of omega-6s to 3 is about 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. Sometimes people even say 2-to-1, but you don't really see anything different other than 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. It's around there. Most of what I've seen is actually 3-to-1. The typical Western standard diet is between 10 and 20-to-1. Some people think that it's much, much higher. I've heard estimates is up to like 60-to-1, which I think is maybe a little extreme. Maybe this person is just not eating any vegetables at all. But typically you're looking at a much higher ratio than what is needed by the body and what has been the case for, most of the time, our time on this earth here. So if you have a better ratio of omega-6 to 3, one of the outcomes is that you're less overweight. They've found that that's pretty true across the board. But probably more importantly is that it suppresses chronic disease. Some of the reason people say is, well, omega-6s are pro-inflammatory and omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. It's not quite that simple. We'll talk about that in a second. But for sure, if you have a ratio of, say, 4-to-1, I made that, sorry, I should have had a colon there. So don't think that that's 4/1, it's 4-to-1. If you have a ratio of 4-to-1 in your omega-3 fatty acids, you end up with a 70% decrease in total mortality for cardiovascular disease. That's pretty good to know. So there are lots of reasons to want to eat more omega-3 fatty acids and to maybe calm down on some of the things that supply omega-6 fatty acids, like more microwave popcorn. Here we have a ratio of about 26-to-1 of omega-6 to omega-3. If that's not bad enough, then we've got sour cream and onion chips, where your ratio is about 53-to-1. And even worse, and surprisingly, people think this is so healthy, trail mix, 140-to-1 in terms of omega-6 to omega-3. So those are all things that I'm not saying never, well, I would never myself eat microwave popcorn, but you want to really look at moderation and maybe not doing this very often. Sprouted pinto beans, I don't know when the last time was that you had any. Sprouted pinto beans are about 1 to 1.75 in terms of their ratio. So they're actually on the other side. I'm not saying you shouldn't eat them because they're on the other side. I'm saying maybe you should, because everybody has a couple potato chips once and here and now. And so you need as much omega-3 as you can get. Here's an example of romaine lettuce. And so this is another instance of the surprising connection between protein, fat, and carbs in plants. People think plants are all carbohydrate. They're just fiber and maybe some, they don't know. They're just like, well, I guess they're carbs. So they're probably bad, right? The way we think these days. Actually, all plants have, like we've said before, all plants have protein, fats, and carbs. And so here you see in romaine lettuce that about a quarter of lettuce is a fat. And it is, they're omega fats. That's primarily what we're talking about is omega fats in the romaine lettuce. Not all of it, but mostly. And so omega 6 to 3 ratio in the plant is 2.8 milligrams of omega-6s to 6.8 milligrams of omega-3. So again, we are topping out a little higher on the omega-3s than the 6s, which is great. And you have to see, this is milligrams. So not a lot. This is not a lot of omega-3s. That's why when you look at nutrition facts, it's going to tell you that lettuce has 0 fat. It's not actually 0. It's because it's enough less than 0 that, of course, it's not negative, right? But if it's enough less than it, okay, I'm saying that wrong. It's between 0 and 1, but it's so much closer that they can't say that it's 1. Therefore, they say that it is 0. And so it's not actually literally 0. It just doesn't get high enough to be reported as anything other than 0, which means if you eat multiple servings of romaine lettuce, then at some point you're going to end up with a little bit more saturated, or I'm sorry, not saturated, with a little more omega fatty acids in your diet than 0 would indicate. Okay, so just know that when it says 0 in anything in terms of nutrition, it doesn't always mean literally 0. It might mean less than 1 and enough less than 1, then it looks more like 0. All right, sources of omega-3s include, like we said, plankton, that's single cell algae, everything that eats it. So we're looking at a lot of sea foods like anchovies, herring, mackerel. Those are high in omega-3s, salmon, sardines, trout, etc. There are a number of seafood that are great sources of omega-3s. The thing that you also have to look at is that they eat other things also. And so depending on the source, seafood might also be a great source of mercury, which you don't want, or other things that you don't want to take in that the fish have eaten or that have become concentrated in that fish tissue. And now you're eating more concentrated sources of things like PCBs or, like I said, mercury. So that's the risk when you're having animal products of any kind, is that in the fat concentrates whatever toxins are eaten by that animal. And so, for example, with cows, if you're eating butter is a very concentrated form of whatever toxins that cow has ingested or has been shot up with or fed. And so you want to really take care to see what is your source of those fats, the butters or fish oils, etc. And really take care, because you are eating a concentrated source of whatever that animal has ingested. All right, all plants have a little bit of omega-3s in them. There's a plant called sea buckthorn. We're going to look at it for just a second. Sea buckthorn has a lot of omega fats, particularly omega-3s. And sea buckthorn is one of the few plants, very interestingly, that actually has the omega-3s in the form of EPA and DHA already. And that's pretty unique and pretty great. So this is a plant. Sea buckthorn, you kind of think of it as growing right on the seashore or in the water or something like. Sea buckthorn actually grows about 12,000 feet over sea level in the Himalayan mountains. Been used for centuries. It's considered actually an adaptogenic plant. We can talk about that. We'll talk about it later in the class. But sea buckthorn is pretty special. It's a beautiful plant. You can grow it in this area if you want. People grow it in Canada in higher, colder regions because it's very, very cold hardy. And so the omega ratio is 3 to 6, which is pretty great. And it's high in a lot of other nutrients, antioxidants, flavonoids, phytosterols, and carotenoids, all of which are critical to body functioning. And we can talk about each one of those later on in the course. But I just want you to see that sea buckthorn is a plant source of a really great plant source of omega-3 fatty acids. You don't have to get it all from fish. Sea buckthorn is one source. There are a number of really good plant sources for omegas. Chia seed is another that's a really great plant source. Hemp seeds are another good plant source. Okay, omega-6 is not as simple as people say. They say, well, omega-6 is bad. Omega-6 is inflammatory. Well, that's not necessarily true. It's an essential fatty acid for reasons, not because your body is like, let's just go inflame everything. Of course not. So linoleic acid is critical for your body. Not all of it is inflammatory. Not all of it is anti-inflammatory. That's because your body is more complicated than we like to think. We want to just divide it all up into never, ever have anything inflammatory, when of course inflammation is a critical process for your body in terms of fighting infection or dealing with injury, etc. You need to have inflammation to help your body survive and to help your body function well. So linoleic acid converts to a number of things. Arachidonic acid converts to the prostaglandins, like we talked about. That results in helping with hormone secretion, which is important for sure. It can result in inflammation. There are 3 different series or types, but they call them series, of prostaglandins. And the omega-6s yield the series 1 and the series 2 kind of prostaglandins. Series 3 come from omega-3s. And so with the omega-6s, series 1 is anti-inflammatory. Series 2 is pro-inflammatory. And then series 3 from the omega-3s are very strongly anti-inflammatory. But here, your body needs all of these types of chemicals, because if you need inflammation, your body has to help you produce it somehow. And everyone needs inflammation here and there. Maybe not as well, certainly not as much as we probably all have it, based on the kinds of things that we eat and breathe and worry about, etc. Okay, so those are the fatty acids. Right now, next group of fats. So we've done fatty acids, focusing primarily on omega-3 and omega-6. There's also omega-7 and omega-9. Omega-7 and 9 are also found in sea buckthorn, by the way. And omega-7, lots of people are interested in because it really helps with skin health. But your body can make those forms of fatty acids, so they're not as important as omega-3 and 6. All right, so here we are now talking about triglycerides. Triglycerides, we all think of them as bad, and having lots and lots and lots of them is not good, but they're critical to your body functioning because that's how you store fats. You can't get them from plants though, but you need them, so your liver makes them. And so if your liver is not making triglycerides, then there's something wrong with you, right? But you don't need as many of them as probably a lot of us have. So liver can make them. It's, sugar, fat, and protein metabolism creates triglycerides because usually it's too much. And so the liver makes triglycerides to store extra fat. Now, this is kind of relevant to the keto diet. If you have a period of starvation or caloric restriction, which happens with a lot of diets or with a lot of ways of eating, then what happens is triglycerides get broken down. So the body will break down triglycerides because they're a great source of energy. And when they get broken down by the body, they break down into what are called ketone bodies. And those ketone bodies are available for energy use. The brain can use them, the body can use them. And so that is part of what the keto diet is about, is creating the conditions in the body so that triglycerides get broken down and the body uses ketones for energy, burning ketones so that you're burning that stored fat instead of burning sugar, which is sort of like a quick fix. Now, we do know that the brain prefers glucose to ketones. The brain can use ketone bodies, but it does seem that the brain prefers glucose. So that's kind of a complicated issue. But if you are curious part of why they do keto, then triglycerides getting broken down is probably the primary reason. This does result in more of an acidic kind of blood and body. And so that response will stimulate your sympathetic nervous system. And so, as you know, or maybe you don't know, maybe we haven't talked enough about it, but a stimulated sympathetic nervous system can result in fatigue over time. If you're kind of chronically understimulated and you're kind of unbalanced and your parasympathetic mode is really the dominating force in your life, then this could be useful. But if your sympathetic nervous system is already stimulated enough, then even more stimulation can result in some problems in terms of how your body functions, and particularly how your adrenal system and endocrine system function as a result from a chronically stimulated sympathetic nervous system. Okay. Third kind of fat, phospholipids. This is the foundation of all membranes. So just like we use omega-3s and omega-6s in the membranes, phospholipids are the foundation of those membranes. They're made of fat, all kinds of importance, right? And again, you're regulating the entry and the exit of these molecules. Phospholipids determine the fluidity of membranes. When they link to fatty acids, like say omega-6s or 3s, let's say they're linking to some omega-3 fatty acids, that's great. There's more fluidity. And then they need to link to some saturated fats. Otherwise, there's no stability. So you need some saturated fat to help make up those cell membranes. Cell membranes are important for a lot of things, but one of them that's relevant to this class, because here we are focusing on psychology, is that phospholipids and their foundation to membranes is important for nerve functioning. You know, if you don't have good membranes or you don't have great constructed myelin sheaths, then it's difficult for your nerves to function like they should. You need omega-3s or 6s in order to create good membranes. And so if you don't have enough omega-3s or omega-6s, then that will disrupt your membrane function, that will disrupt your cellular health. And again, it's true if you don't have enough omega-3s and you have plenty of omega-6s, you still need those omega-3s. They're still critical, and that will disrupt your health without enough omega-3s. All right, so the fourth kind, cholesterol. Cholesterol is a kind of fat that is also essential for health and well-being. Part of what cholesterol does is it helps heal. And so it's sort of like, you could think of it as part of the body ambulance. When there's an injury or some sort of problem in the body and inflammation happens, then the ambulance rushes to that spot. And part of what's in the ambulance that helps heal is cholesterol. And so a lot of times when you see higher levels of cholesterol and it's an indication of inflammation, cholesterol is not the problem. Cholesterol is part of what the body is doing to fix it. And so what you're doing is you're seeing that there's high levels of cholesterol, but we are assuming that cholesterol is therefore the problem, instead of thinking cholesterol is part of what the body is trying to do to fix the problem. The inflammation problem is coming from other places. It's not coming from cholesterol. Cholesterol is associated with it because cholesterol goes to where inflammation happens, it goes there to fix it. But to call it the problem is pretty much a misunderstanding of how it works. So cholesterol, absolutely essential for your health. In your typical diet, you're getting almost up to almost a gram a day in a typical diet, but your body will produce a gram a day. And what we see is that your dietary intake of cholesterol doesn't really have much of an effect on how much cholesterol is in the body. If you lower your intake of cholesterol, your body tends to make more to make up for it. What we do know is that if you eat a lot of sugar, the high sugar diet will increase your blood cholesterol levels. And if you can think of it as being likely more of a function of greater inflammation from the sugar, that therefore you're requiring more cholesterol to go fix more problems. So it's sort of like you're just asking for more ambulances in your body. And the more ambulances you have, the more cholesterol you have. But the reason the ambulance is there is not because of the cholesterol. Cholesterol makes a lot of things. It makes bile salts. If you don't have bile salts, you're going to have very large problems digesting fat. Bile salts are really, really important, and they're made out of cholesterol. Steroid hormones, all kinds of hormones in your body, not the illegal kind, but the kind your body makes. We call them steroid hormones. Those are made out of cholesterol. Your sex hormones, estrogen, etc. Those are made out of cholesterol. The cholesterol right under your skin is what the sun turns into vitamin D. So if you don't have enough cholesterol, then it might be hard to have enough vitamin D. And it might be hard to then digest your vitamin D because you're low on bile salts. Cholesterol also helps regulate evaporation of the water, cell fluidity, but also evaporation of your water from your skin. And so if your skin gets really dry, a lot of times with an animal, you'll feed that animal oil to help their skin become healthier and more shiny. Same thing for humans. It's not like we're that different. And so cholesterol will help prevent water being evaporated from your skin. It also helps prevent your skin from absorbing toxins. So good things there from cholesterol. Now, you can damage fats. Saturated fats are really hard to damage. The polyunsaturated fats are the ones that are very most delicate. And so that's why you have to be careful when you cook, that you're primarily using saturated fat for cooking. And your, things like olive oil tend to be a little bit more fragile than saturated fats. Now, one of the things about olive oil is that we found that olive oil that is adulterated and that's not pure, real, pure olive oil is actually more fragile than pure olive oil. So much of what gets sold is not pure olive oil, and that can turn into trans fats much more easily through damage by high heat, etc., than pure olive oil. And so you want to really take care when you're purchasing olive oil that you're getting a brand that we know is like actually really pure olive oil instead of something that is olive oil plus we don't know. So heat, light, oxygen, so heating, cooking, etc. When you process food, you're exposing fat to all of these things, to heat, light, and oxygen. And that is in part why processed foods can be less healthy for you, because you've damaged the fats that are in there, and then they can't really do their jobs as well. Or they become hydrogenated and become trans fats, which are extraordinarily bad for you. So as we look at saturated fat, and I'll just make a couple comments on your chapter in the Brain Food book. The trans fat, I agree with that part. But the saturated fat section in the book, where it says saturated fat is the bad. So trans fat's the ugly, and then saturated fat is the bad. I disagree with that. What she is focusing on are research studies that don't discriminate between saturated fat versus trans fat. So for a long time, those two were just lumped together. Saturated fat, trans fat, they were all put in the same group in any studies. And so it's only more recently that we've started to pull out saturated fat versus trans fat, and make sure that we're not including trans fat, because trans fat has such a distinctly different and worse impact on all kinds of variables. That might be why a lot of these studies have shown that saturated fat was bad, because trans fat was included in the saturated fat group. And so I disagree with her results. And I was a little disappointed in this section. She says it's been well established, but it hasn't been well established that saturated fat is bad. And then she lists a whole number of findings, like things where she says things like a number of well-controlled trials have shown blah, 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 but she does not reference those. There are a number of references now that are more recent that do say saturated fat is actually useful. And so, for example, in British Medical Journal, saturated fat is part of a healthy diet. And so there's some discussion there on a number of meta-analyses looking at lots of different studies. And their conclusion is saturated fat can be part of a healthy diet. What you don't want is trans fat. The other thing that people do is they throw out all of the saturated fats instead of looking at the difference between plant-based saturated fats and animal-based saturated fats. And so in studies, if they lump them all together and they think saturated fat equals saturated fat across the line and it doesn't matter where it comes from, this also is very, very simplistic thinking. And what we find when you look at things more closely are that plant-based saturated fats do perform differently than animal-based saturated fats. And so here's a study that, the very last one listed here, that looked at olive oil and coconut oil and butter and said that coconut oil acts more like olive oil in the body and butter does not. And so here we've got an animal-based and a plant-based fat that seem to act in different ways. And so again, back to the theme of too reductionistic, too simplified, not looking at all of the things, maybe, well, certainly not maybe, certainly not knowing what to look for as we start to try to figure things out here. So science is not perfect. It's not perfect. We have to know all of the things in order to perform a good study. And the fact is we just don't know all of the things. Okay, so that ends our section on fats, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks.